Before you reach for the hair dye, before you sit down in that chair and spend the next 2 hours covering up something you've assumed was simply inevitable, I want you to spend 25 minutes with me today, because there's a very specific reason your hair may have started going gray that most doctors never connect to hair color at all. That's completely testable with a standard blood test. That's common enough after 60 that I'd estimate a significant proportion of people watching this video right now have this condition without knowing it, and that's entirely correctable, with real documented effects on hair pigmentation in the people who address it. By the time we finish today, you're going to understand something about the biology of gray hair that the vast majority of people, including most of their doctors, have never had explained clearly. And you're going to have a specific actionable step to take before you make another appointment at the salon. I'm Dr. Hale Thorne, and I've spent more than 30 years in clinical medicine. And I want to start with something honest that most conversations about gray hair and nutrition never include. There is no vitamin, no supplement, no dietary intervention of any kind that restores hair that is already white back to its original color. The melanocytes, the pigment-producing cells that sit in your hair follicles and determine the color of each new hair that grows, once they've permanently stopped functioning or died, don't restart because you took a supplement. I want to say that clearly at the beginning because I think you deserve an honest conversation rather than an oversold promise that sets you up for disappointment. What the research does show, and what I genuinely believe deserves far more attention than it gets in clinical practice, is that a very specific and extremely common nutritional deficiency after age 60 causes accelerated and premature loss of hair pigmentation in ways that are preventable and, in the people who address it before the pigment-producing cells have permanently shut down, potentially reversible in the sense that new hair growth in those individuals shows restored or improved pigmentation compared to what was growing before the deficiency was corrected. This is not the same claim as reversing white hair entirely, but it is a real and meaningful clinical finding, one that most people in their 60s and 70s have never been told about, and one that I think is worth understanding clearly. Before we get into it, I want you to do something for me down in the comments. Tell me your age and tell me whether your hair has been going gray more quickly than you expected for your age, or more quickly in the past few years than in the previous decade. I read every single comment on these videos, and the answers to this particular question, alongside the blood test result I'm going to describe, would tell me far more about what's actually happening with your hair than any examination of the hair itself ever could. Let me start with the biology of why hair turns gray in the first place, because most people's understanding of this is incomplete in ways that matter significantly for the conversation we're about to have, and because the nuance here is exactly the nuance that makes the difference between hair color loss that's potentially addressable and hair color loss that isn't. Each hair follicle in your scalp contains a small population of specialized cells called melanocytes, whose entire job is to produce pigment, specifically a protein called melanin, and to deposit that pigment into the hair fiber as it's being formed and grows. Melanin comes in two varieties, eumelanin, which produces black and brown tones, and pheomelanin, which produces red and yellow tones, and the combination and relative concentration of these two types, determined by your genetics, is what produces your individual hair color. Each of these melanocytes in your follicle is descended from a stem cell population that lives in a specific region of the follicle called the bulge region, and each time a hair sheds naturally and a new growth cycle begins, new melanocytes are recruited from this stem cell reserve to repopulate the active follicle and begin pigment production for the new hair. As you age, the melanocyte stem cells within the bulge region of each follicle gradually become depleted through a combination of oxidative damage accumulated over years of continuous pigment production, DNA damage from chronic UV exposure, and what appears to be a natural programmed aging process in the stem cell population itself. As the stem cell reserve depletes, follicles have fewer melanocytes available for each new hair cycle. They produce less pigment per hair, and eventually a follicle whose melanocyte stem cell population has been fully exhausted produces a hair with no pigment at all, the white hair that is the visible result of this process. This is the mechanism most people know about in a general way, and it is real, and it is genuinely irreversible once the stem cell population in a particular follicle is gone, because there is nothing to replenish it from. But here's the critical distinction that most people and most doctors miss. Within the population of gray and white hairs on any given person's head at any given time, there are almost certainly two different types of follicles present simultaneously. Some follicles have genuinely and permanently lost their melanocyte stem cell populations, and the hairs they produce will be white regardless of anything else you do, because the cells that would produce the pigment are simply no longer there. But other follicles still have melanocyte populations that are present and theoretically capable of producing pigment, but that are producing inadequate amounts of it, or no visible amount of it, because the biochemical environment those melanocytes are operating in is nutritionally insufficient in specific ways that suppress their function without destroying the cells themselves. These are the follicles where nutritional correction can make a real difference, where melanocytes that are underperforming due to addressable deficiency can, when that deficiency is corrected, resume producing melanin at levels that result in visibly darker new hair growth. Telling these two populations apart from the outside is impossible, which is one reason why the response to B12 correction is variable from person to person and why expectations need to be realistic rather than guaranteed. But it's also why the response in people like Arthur, where the deficiency has been present long enough to suppress melanocyte function, but perhaps not long enough to permanently exhaust the stem cell reserve, can be genuinely and visibly meaningful. Why is B12 so specifically important for hair pigmentation? The mechanism connects to something fundamental about how melanocytes produce pigment. Melanin synthesis requires a functioning pathway involving several biochemical steps, and one of these steps depends on an enzyme system that requires adequate B12 as a cofactor. Without sufficient B12, this enzymatic pathway runs inefficiently. Melanin production is reduced even in melanocytes that still have the intrinsic capacity to produce pigment, and the result is hair that grows paler or grayer than it would have produced if the melanocyte's biochemistry were fully supported. The melanocyte itself may still be present, may still be fundamentally viable, but it's running at reduced capacity because it lacks a critical input that its biochemistry requires. This is a fundamentally different situation from a follicle whose melanocytes have been permanently lost. And it is this specific situation, melanocytes that are present but underperforming due to nutritional insufficiency, where correcting the deficiency can make a real and measurable difference to the pigmentation of newly growing hair. B12 also plays a critical role in the process of methylation throughout the body, a biochemical process that affects gene expression in cells including melanocytes, and emerging research suggests that altered methylation patterns in melanocyte stem cells may be one of the mechanisms through which B12 deficiency specifically accelerates the loss of melanocyte function over time, making the depletion happen faster than it would in an adequately nourished individual. This adds another layer to the connection beyond the direct enzymatic role, suggesting that B12 insufficiency not only reduces pigment production in existing melanocytes, but may also accelerate the loss of those melanocytes through epigenetic effects on their stem cell populations. Now here's where the conversation becomes particularly relevant for people over 60 specifically, and why this isn't just a general nutritional consideration, but something with special and urgent significance for this age group. Vitamin B12 is unusual among essential nutrients in that it requires a highly specific and elaborate absorption process, involving a protein called intrinsic factor that is produced by specialized cells in the stomach lining to be absorbed in meaningful quantities from food. Most nutrients are absorbed relatively straightforwardly across the intestinal wall once food has been broken down, but B12 needs this intrinsic factor escort to be taken up in the final section of the small intestine, the ileum, and the whole system depends on both adequate gastric acid production and adequate intrinsic factor production working together properly. The production of intrinsic factor by the stomach depends on the health of the stomach lining and on adequate gastric acid production, both of which decline naturally with age in ways that are clinically significant and that accelerate particularly after 60. After 60, a meaningful proportion of people develop a condition called atrophic gastritis, in which the stomach lining gradually thins over years, and both acid production and intrinsic factor production decrease to the point where B12 absorption is measurably compromised. This is not a dramatic or symptomatic process. It produces no obvious warning signs that would prompt someone to seek evaluation, and it continues to worsen gradually over years in a way that is almost entirely invisible until the consequences have been accumulating for a substantial period of time. A person in their late 60s may be eating perfectly adequate amounts of B12 in their daily diet through meat, fish, eggs, dairy, and other animal products that are genuinely rich in B12, but absorbing only a fraction of what they actually consume because the intrinsic factor system that was working reliably at 40 is now running at significantly reduced capacity, and there is no symptom, no feeling, no daily signal that tells them this is happening. This problem is compounded by the extremely widespread use of proton pump inhibitor medications for acid reflux and gastroesophageal symptoms, medications like omeprazole, pantoprazole, esomeprazole, and their various generic equivalents, which are consistently among the most prescribed medication classes in the developed world, and which work specifically by substantially reducing stomach acid production. The same stomach acid that these medications reduce is the same acid that the B12 absorption system requires to function properly, and people who have been taking proton pump inhibitors for years, as many people over 60 have, are chronically suppressing their own B12 absorption on top of any age-related decline in intrinsic factor that may already be occurring. The combination in many individuals produces a B12 deficiency that accumulates silently and slowly over years because B12 is stored in the liver in amounts that can sustain normal function for 1 to 3 or even more years before stores are depleted enough to produce measurable blood level changes or obvious clinical symptoms. The deficiency builds gradually, the reserves deplete slowly, and by the time it appears on a blood test or produces consequences obvious enough to prompt someone to connect them back to B12, it may have been affecting melanocyte function, neurological health, and multiple other B12-dependent processes for years, in some cases many years, without anyone connecting the dots. There is also a third mechanism worth understanding that makes this particularly relevant for people over 60 who may have been vegetarian or vegan for any significant period of time, or who have simply reduced their consumption of animal products over the years for health or other reasons. Vitamin B12 is found almost exclusively in animal products. It is not present in meaningful bioavailable quantities in plant foods with the exception of certain algae and fermented foods in forms and concentrations that are not reliably sufficient for human needs. Someone who has been following a predominantly plant-based diet for years may have been relying on B12 fortified foods or supplements inconsistently, and the cumulative deficit from this source alone can produce the same pattern of slow-onset B12 deficiency that the absorption-impaired individual develops through a different route, arriving at the same clinical picture from a different starting point. Let me tell you about a patient of mine, a man named Arthur, 67 years old, a retired chemistry teacher who had always been proud of having kept his natural dark brown hair through his late 50s, while most of his contemporaries had gone significantly gray, something he attributed vaguely to good genes and that he'd never given much medical thought to. Around age 62, roughly 4 years into taking a proton pump inhibitor for gastric reflux that had been managed without medication before his mid-50s, his hair began graying rapidly, not gradually, in the way his hair color had slowly lightened through his 40s and early 50s, but in a noticeably accelerated way that felt different to him in its pace. A more rapid spreading of gray that he noticed each time he looked in the mirror over the course of about 18 months. He mentioned it to me somewhat self-consciously during an appointment that was primarily scheduled around his blood pressure management, half expecting me to offer a generic acknowledgement and move on, the way he'd experienced with the 2 previous occasions he'd mentioned it to other doctors in passing. Instead, I asked him a series of questions about his medications, how long he'd been on the proton pump inhibitor, whether he'd had any blood tests specifically measuring B12, and what his dietary protein intake looked like. He'd been on the acid medication for approximately 4 years. He'd never had a B12 level measured specifically. He ate meat and eggs regularly and had no obvious dietary reason to expect deficiency. I drew a B12 level that same day, along with a broader metabolic panel. The result came back with a B12 level that was clearly below the reference range's lower limit. Not borderline low, not low normal, but frankly deficient in a man who was eating animal protein regularly, which told us immediately that the issue was absorption rather than dietary intake. Exactly the picture you'd expect in someone with 4 years of acid-suppressing medication on top of age-related atrophic gastritis changes. I explained the mechanism to him in detail, which as a former chemistry teacher, he found immediately compelling, and which he then asked clarifying questions about for the better part of 20 minutes. He was genuinely surprised that the connection between his reflux medication and his hair had never been mentioned, given that the biochemistry behind it was straightforward enough that he could have understood it when it was first prescribed if anyone had thought to mention it. We started him on methylcobalamin in sublingual form, not standard oral cyanocobalamin tablets, because sublingual methylcobalamin bypasses the intrinsic factor absorption pathway that was compromised and delivers B12 directly through the oral mucosa into the bloodstream. This distinction in supplementation form matters considerably for people with absorption impairment, which is a nuance most people who buy B12 supplements on their own entirely miss, taking standard swallowed oral tablets that depend on the same failing absorption system for their uptake. At Arthur's follow-up appointment approximately 7 months later, he showed me his hair along his temples and hairline, the areas where new growth was most visible against the lighter existing hair. The new growth was noticeably and objectively darker than the hair that had grown in during the period immediately before treatment, darker in a way that surprised even him given his measured expectations coming into the follow-up. Not completely restored to the deep brown of his 50s, but meaningfully and obviously darker in new growth, in a pattern entirely consistent with melanocytes that had been functionally suppressed by B12 insufficiency, now producing more melanin as the biochemical environment improved. He told me, with the precise language of a man who'd spent 40 years teaching the chemistry of enzymatic reactions, that he'd known the biochemistry of B12-dependent pathways for decades, and had never once made the connection to his own hair color until someone told him to look for it. Now, a quick pause here. If you've made it this far in this video, go ahead and tap that like button. It genuinely helps this information reach more people who might be experiencing exactly what Arthur was experiencing without anyone connecting the dots for them. And let me know in the comments, have you ever had your B12 level specifically checked? Not just a general panel, but B12 specifically? The answer from most people in their 60s and 70s is no, and I think that matters more than most people realize. Let me give you the specific practical steps, because understanding this is only useful if you know what to actually do about it, and the action required here is considerably more specific than simply buying a B12 supplement from the nearest pharmacy shelf. The first step is to ask your doctor to check your B12 level specifically, using your name for it and asking for it by name, vitamin B12 serum level, because it does not appear on most standard comprehensive metabolic panels or routine annual blood panels unless it is ordered individually, and many doctors won't think to include it in the absence of a specific indication flagged on their checklist. The reference range for B12 on most laboratory reports considers anything above around 200 picograms per milliliter as normal, but there is meaningful clinical evidence, including evidence from neurological research, that functional B12 deficiency, meaning B12 insufficiency that affects the tissues that depend on it, including melanocytes and neurons, can occur at levels that are within the lower portion of the labeled reference range, particularly in older adults whose tissues may have adapted to lower levels over time in ways that make the standard reference range less reliable as a guide to genuine functional sufficiency. Some clinicians who work extensively with this area advocate for a target of 400 to 500 picograms per milliliter as genuine sufficiency in adults over 60 rather than simply being above the lower label limit of 200, and knowing your actual numerical result rather than simply hearing it's normal gives you and your doctor the specific information needed to make an informed decision about whether correction is warranted. The second step, if your level is genuinely low or in the lower portion of the reference range, is to discuss the optimal form and route of supplementation with your doctor, given your specific situation, because the form matters enormously, and most self-directed B12 supplementation misses this critical nuance. For people with intact stomach function and not on acid-suppressing medications, standard oral B12 may be absorbed adequately at high doses. For people in their 60s or 70s with any degree of gastric acid reduction from age alone or from medication, sublingual methylcobalamin, which is absorbed through the oral mucosa directly into the bloodstream without requiring the intrinsic factor pathway, is generally considerably more reliable. B12 intramuscular injections are the most direct and reliable approach for people with significant demonstrated malabsorption, and they bypass the entire gastrointestinal system entirely. The form of B12 also matters, with methylcobalamin and adenosylcobalamin being the forms the body uses most directly, requiring less metabolic conversion than the cyanocobalamin form found in most inexpensive supplements. The third step is to have patience, specifically a patience measured in months rather than weeks, because even when B12 correction produces changes in new hair pigmentation, those changes are only visible as new hairs grow in over the natural hair growth cycle, which produces roughly half an inch of hair per month on average. Results, if they occur, become visible gradually over 6 to 12 months of consistent correction, and drawing conclusions before that timeline has elapsed misses the window where the evidence, such as it is, would actually appear. I want to be clear and measured about what to expect if you do discover a B12 deficiency and address it properly. Hairs that are already white will not turn dark again because the follicles that produce them have lost pigment-producing activity that B12 repletion cannot restore. What can change in people who address deficiency before the melanocyte populations in their follicles have been permanently exhausted is the pigmentation of newly growing hair, the hair that will emerge over the coming months as existing hairs naturally shed and new ones grow in their place. This is a process measured in months and years, not days and weeks, and it requires consistent, sustained correction of the deficiency rather than a brief course of supplementation. It also requires honest management of expectations because some proportion of white hair in every individual reflects the genuine, age-related permanent loss of melanocytes that no nutritional intervention can address, and only the component that reflects functional suppression of viable melanocytes by B12 insufficiency is potentially responsive to correction. So here's what I want you to take away from today. Before your next hair appointment where you were planning to color gray hair you've assumed was simply inevitable, make one phone call to your doctor's office and ask for a B12 level to be added to your next blood panel, and ask them to give you the actual numerical result rather than simply telling you it's within the normal range. If the result comes back low or in the lower portion of the reference range, have a specific conversation about the right form of supplementation for your situation, one that accounts for your age, your medications, and your absorption capacity rather than defaulting to the cheapest option on the pharmacy shelf. Give it 6 to 12 months of consistent correction before expecting to see any changes in hair pigmentation that are visible, because the evidence of change, if there is any, appears in new growth rather than existing hairs and takes time to accumulate enough to be obvious. And recognize that even if the hair pigmentation change you experience is modest or partial, the broader health significance of correcting a B12 deficiency, including effects on energy, on neurological function, on the cardiovascular risk that elevated homocysteine from B12 deficiency creates, makes the correction worthwhile entirely independently of what it does for your hair, and would make this conversation worth having even if hair color were never part of it at all. I think about the number of people over 60 who are sitting in hair salon chairs right now covering something with dye that might in some cases be at least partially addressable at the source through something as accessible as a blood test and a sublingual vitamin, and who have never been told that this connection exists because it falls in the gap between the specialties that would logically own it. That gap is something I try to close in every conversation I can. Before you go, think of someone in your life who has noticed their hair graying more quickly than expected, particularly someone who is over 60 and has been on acid reflux medication for any significant period of time, and share this video with them. This connection between proton pump inhibitors, age-related B12 malabsorption, and hair pigmentation is one that falls through the cracks of standard medical practice with remarkable consistency. And sharing information about it is one of the most genuinely useful things you can do for someone in this situation. And if you want to know the other two nutrients whose deficiency I most consistently find in patients over 60 who are experiencing accelerated changes in hair, skin, and nail quality, and that are almost never addressed because most doctors don't connect them to those symptoms, that's exactly what I'm covering in the next video, so don't miss it. This video is for general educational information based on clinical experience and published research, and is not a substitute for a conversation with your own doctor, who knows your specific health history and medication situation far better than I ever could from all the way over here. Take good care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.